Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The city lights reflected off the shattered windows of the skyscraper, casting jagged beams across the broken streets below. Smoke billowed from the deep scars in the pavement, and twisted metal frames of cars stood like monuments to a battle that had shaken the city to its core. In the midst of the chaos, Tony Stark adjusted his metallic gauntlet, the familiar whir of his suit, its internal systems, a comforting sound amidst the destruction. "Stark, you see him," came the familiar voice of Clark Kent over their shared comm channel. Even through the static, Tony could hear the concern laced into the Kryptonian Cell's voice. Tony didn't answer immediately. His visor zoomed in on the distant figure hovering above the wreckage of the financial district, the man's silhouette backlit by the fires raging beneath him. The figure was familiar, eerily. So a hulking form wrapped in a suit of armor that was nearly identical to Tony's own, but sleeker, more advanced. His cape billowed in the wind like Clark said, but it had a menacing air to it, as though its purpose was not to inspire but to dominate. "I see him," Ted Lee responded, his voice flat, airy, "and I don't like what I see." The figure descended slowly, surveying the destruction with a kind of detached superiority. When he finally landed, the ground beneath him cracked as if the earth itself was bowing under his weight. Clark arrived beside Tony in a blur, the red of his cape stark against the darkened skyline. He too fixed his eyes on the figure before them. "He's us," Clark said quietly, "but stronger." "Stronger," Tony agreed, his mind already racing with calculations. "Rius and smarter." Apparently, the dimensional traveler, as they had come to call him, stood 100 yards away, his gaze fixed on the two heroes. There was no malice in his expression. Just cold, unyielding purpose. This wasn't personal for him. It was duty. "I know what you were thinking," the traveler called out, his voice a deep, resonant echo that seemed to vibrate through the steel structures around them. "You believe you can stop me, that you read the protectors of this world, but wrong." Tony clenched his fists, feeling the reassuring hum of his suit's repulsor rays charging. Clark stepped forward, his tone calm but filled with authority. "Stare you down until I belong here. Go back to where you came from." The traveler shook his head. "Where I came from is gone, Superman. My world is a memory, destroyed by the mistakes of people like you." Tony raised an eyebrow beneath his helmet. "And what do you think you can fix ours by destroying it?" "No," the traveler said, taking a step closer. "I am not here to destroy. I am here to save this world, and to do that, I need to tear it down first." Without warning, the ground beneath their feet erupted. Concrete and steel shot into the air as the traveler unleashed a wave of force from his gauntlet-clad hand. Tony's sensors screamed with warnings as he and Clark were thrown back, slamming into the nearest building. Clark was up first, shaking off the debris like it was dust. Tony groaned, pushing himself to his feet. His armor had absorbed most of the impact, but his pride had taken a hit. Sky was playing for keep. "Okay," Tony muttered, his voice strained. "And round two." Clark nodded, his eyes glowing red as he prepared for the next assault. The traveler stood amidst the swirling dust and debris, watching them calmly. He was stronger than either of them, and they both knew it. He had the raw power of Superman and the intelligence of Iron Man, but he lacked their restraint. That was what made him dangerous. "Stark," Clark said, his voice low. "We have to stop him now." "Yeah, I got that part, big blue trag," Tony replied, recalibrating his suit's energy output. "But stopping him isn't going to be as easy as just throwing him into the sun." Clark frowned. "It's not that simple." "Exactly, and that's a product of our worst traits magnified. If we don't figure out what makes him tick, so we're just going to be playing defense until he levels the whole city." The traveler suddenly moved faster than Tony's sensors could track. One moment, he was standing in the middle of the street, and the next, he was in front of Clark, his fist crashing into the Kryptonian's jaw, with enough force to send shockwaves through the air. Clark flew backwards, smashing through a skyscraper and disappearing into the rubble. Tony didn't have time to react before the traveler turned on him. He barely managed to activate his thrusters, propelling himself backward just as a blast of energy from the traveler's sand palm vaporized the spot where he had been standing. "Impressive," the traveler remarked, his tone almost conversational, "tear futile." Tony gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He needed to find a weakness, anything that could give them an edge. But as he scanned the traveler's armor, he saw nothing. It was flawless. Every system, every function was optimized. better than anything Tony had ever designed. "Clark, we need a new plan," Tony said through gritted teeth, hoping the Kryptonian was still conscious. Clark Sauer's voice crackled over the comms. "I am open to suggestion." Tony dodged another blast, his repulsors firing back in kind. The traveler deflected the energy beams with ease, his movements precise and calculated. Tony couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting a version of himself, one without the moral compass that kept him grounded. "Buy me some time," Tony said, his mind already working through the possibility. "I need to figure out how to shut that portal before he brings more of his kind through." Clark reappeared, flying at the traveler with a renewed fury. Their fists collided in the air, the force of their class sending shockwaves through the city. Tony used the distraction to retreat, his suit systems working overtime as he analyzed the dimensional rift that the traveler had come through. The data was overwhelming, but Tony's Sarrant mind was sharper than ever. He saw the patterns, the fractures in space-time, and he knew what needed to be done. The portal could be sealed, but it would take more power than even his suit could muster. "Clark, Tony said, his voice tense. "I've got a plan, but it's risky." Clark dodged a punch, his breath labored as he responded. "I don't think we have the luxury of playing it safe." Tony smirked despite the situation. "Fair point." The traveler, sensing something was amiss, turned his attention to Tony. His eyes narrowed behind his visor. "Stark, you think you can stop me? Stark, you think your technology will save you?" Tony did to flinch.
It's hard. So, isn't that? It's not about saving this world, and you were just a glitch in the system.
With that, Tony unleashed everything his suit had. The repulsors on his palms blazed with energy, firing a concentrated beam directly at the traveler. For the first time, the traveler stumbled, caught off guard by the sheer force of the attack. Clark seized the opportunity, rushing forward and grabbing the traveler by the throat. His grip tightened, and for a moment it looked like they had the upper hand. But the traveler wasn't tamed on. He let out a roar, his eyes glowing with the same heat vision that Clark possessed. The blast hit Clark square in the chest, sending him flying backward once more. Tony's heart raced. They were running out of time. He had to close the portal before it was too late. His HUD lit up with warnings as the traveler advanced on him, his armor smoking from the earlier attack, but still functional. Tony could see the determination in his eyes, the same determination he saw in himself every time he looked in the mirror. "Give it up, Stark," the traveler said, his voice colder you can. Tony's mind raced. He couldn't out-fight him, and he couldn't out-smart him, not in the conventional sense, but maybe there was another way. He tapped into his suit's SOCOM system, sending a secure message to Clark. "I've got one last idea. It's a long shot, but that's all we've got." Clark Sauer's voice crackled through the static. "Sorry, I am with you." Tony took a deep breath. "On my mark, hit him with everything you've got." The traveler loomed closer, his hands glowing with power. "Fail. This is the end. Start." Tony's eyes narrowed behind his visor. Turn not yet. With a final surge of energy, Tony activated his suit self-destruct sequence, not to destroy himself, but to overload the systems around him. The power surge hit the dimensional rift like a bomb, destabilizing it. The traveler's eyes widened in surprise as the portal behind him began to crack and warp. He turned just in time to see Clark flying at him with the full force of his Kryptonian strength. The impact sent both of them hurtling toward the portal. "Now, Clark," Tony shouted, his voice strained. Clark didn't hesitate. He unleashed a blast of heat vision, focused on the traveler's chest. The force was enough to push him into the swirling chaos of the portal. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then with a deafening roar, the portal collapsed in on itself, taking the traveler with it. Tony Stark stood amidst the dust and rubble, his chest heaving as the last remnants of the dimensional rift flickered and vanished from existence. For a moment, the city seemed eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The fires still burned, the debris still smoldered, but the overwhelming sense of danger had faded. The traveler was gone, sucked back into the void from which he had come. Clark Kent landed beside Tony, his usually calm expression strained, his cape torn and singed from the battle. He glanced at the sky, scanning the area with his superhuman senses before finally relaxing. "He's gone," Clark said, the words heavy with both relief and exhaustion. Tony's helmet retracted, revealing his sweat-soaked face. TCV. But not without nearly leveling half the city. Hard, his voice was laced with frustration, though he couldn't deny the sense of accomplishment settling in the pit of his stomach. They'd done it, but at what cost? Clark's eyes moved across the devastated landscape, buildings reduced to rubble, streets torn apart, and countless civilians who had fled their homes in terror. They will have to rebuild, he said quietly. Tony snorted, brushing dust off his suit's now damaged frame. Yeah, that's the easy part. Rebuilding is what we do best. He paused, glancing at Clark. What I'm more worried about is what comes next. The traveler he was just one. Who's sent to say there aren't two more like him waiting to cross over? Clark's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. We stopped him. We closed the portal. For now, Tony added, his voice carrying the weight of caution. He'd seen too many threats in his time to ever be comfortable with a temporary solution. But that rift, it wasn't just some random tear in space. Something caused it. Someone made it possible. And if they did it once, they can do it again. Clark didn't respond immediately, his eyes focused on the horizon as if searching for answers beyond the visible world. Then we'll be ready. Tony grinned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Trey, always the optimist, remind me how you do that. Clark smiled faintly. For a brief moment, there was silence between them, an unspoken understanding of the burdens they both carried. Tony had always been the realist, the man who prepared for the worst because he had seen the worst. Clark was the symbol of hope, the one who never wavered in his belief that the world could be better, that people could be better. It was why they worked together, despite their differences. Tony sighed and activated his suit. Internal diagnostics. His HUD flickered with damage reports and low energy warning. He was exhausted, both mentally and physically, and he knew Clark was too even if he didn't show it as much. We need to figure out how that rift opened in the first place, and we need to make sure it never happens again. Clark nodded, but before they could speak further, a distant rumbling caught their attention. Tony's eyes widened as he scanned the area, his heart sinking when he realized where the sound was coming from. Tony, Clark said, his voice sharp with concern. Before either of them could react, several of the weakened skyscrapers, their foundations damaged beyond repair from the earlier battle, began to collapse in slow motion. Massive chunks of debris rained down from the sky, threatening to crush whatever remained of the street below. Tony didn't hesitate. His thrusters flared to life, and he shot toward the falling buildings, activating every remaining ounce of power in his suit to hold up the crumbling structure. "Who'll get the people out?" he shouted at Clark, his voice strained under the effort. Clark didn't waste a second. In a blur of motion, he was everywhere at once, speeding through the streets and grabbing bystanders who had remained hidden, pulling them to safety in the blink of an eye. His superhuman strength allowed him to lift cars, rubble, and even parts of buildings out of the way as he moved, saving dozens of lives in mere moments. Tony's suit groaned under the weight of the collapsing structures, his arc reactor pulsing with warning lights as it struggled to maintain the load. "Come on, hold together," he muttered through clenched teeth, his muscles burning from the effort. Just when it seemed like the strain would be too much, Clark returned, his hands slamming into the sides of the buildings alongside Tony. Together, their combined strength was enough to stabilize the structures long enough for the last of the civilians to escape. Once the people were safe, Tony disengaged his thrusters and stepped back, his body trembling from the exertion. The buildings finally collapsed fully, but without anyone in harm's way. The damage was merely structural. Tony sank to the ground, breathing heavily as his suit began to power down, its systems fried from the overload. He stared up at the sky, feeling the weight of the battle settle into his bones. "Sorry, I am getting too old for this." Clark stood nearby, his eyes scanning the city once more. "We did what we had to." "Yeah, I know," that Tony said, rubbing the back of his neck, but this was different. He wasn't just some alien invader or power-hungry maniac. He was us, Clark, in another world that could have been me or you. Clark's expression softened, and he walked over to Tony, extending a hand to help him up. Higher, but it wasn't Tatis, and that's Sarish what mattered. Tony accepted the help, standing up with a wince. Does it, though? The traveler believed he was doing the right thing. He thought he was saving our world by destroying it. How long before we start thinking the same way? Clark shook his head. "We won, because we have each other. We keep each other grounded." Tony chuckled, though it was a tired sound. Grounded. Funny choice of words coming from the guy who can fly faster than sound. Clark smiled. "You know what I mean?" "Yeah, I do, turned and looked out over the city. The fire's now mostly under control. Emergency crews already arriving to begin the cleanup. It would take time, months, maybe even years, but the city would recover. People always found a way to rebuild, to move forward. That was the nature of humanity, and it was something Tony admired even if he didn't always share their boundless optimism. For now, though, the immediate crisis was over, the traveler was gone, and the dimensional rift had been sealed. But Tony couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger, something they might not be ready for. Clark, Tony said after a long moment, "Do you ever think about what's out there beyond this? Other dimensions, other versions of us, maybe ones that aren't as nice." Clark's gaze shifted, and for a moment, his expression was unreadable. "I think about it sometimes, but we can't worry about what we can trade control. We have to focus on protecting this world." Tony nodded slowly. "Yeah, you were right." But even as he said the words, he couldn't help but wonder if they were prepared for whatever might come next. The traveler had given them a glimpse of what could be an alternate version of their world, where things had gone wrong, where their counterparts had become something else, something dangerous. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the city, Tony and Clark stood side by side, two heroes who had just saved the world from an enemy unlike any they had ever faced. But the questions that lingered in Tony's mind wouldn't be so easily shaken. There was always another threat on the horizon, and next time they might not be so lucky. "Come on," said, turning away from the ruined cityscape. "See for all, let's get some rest. We vet that." Clark followed, his footsteps steady and sure. "We'll be ready for whatever comes next." Tony didn't respond, but as they walked toward what was left of Stark Tower, his thoughts were already racing ahead. There was always a next time, and when it came, they would need to be stronger, smarter, and more united than ever. Because if the traveler had taught him anything, it was that the worst threats weren't always the ones they saw coming. They were the ones that looked back at them in the mirror.